the Houston Astros, the Cardinals and the Astros, and the Nationals share a facility up in West Palm Beach. But like when I was a kid, the Dodgers were in South Florida for spring training in Dodger Town and Vero. The Yankees played in Fort Lauderdale. Now they don't play.
Vero Beach, I forget who was there.
The Dodgers. Yeah, because they still have Dodger Town is still there.
Actually got baseball now, whether it's got to be.
Everything is in baseball. All right, we are just about time to get started. I'm watching the TikTok. T minus 15 seconds. Hello to Philip, who didn't want to make the trek in this terrible weather. Steve, how are you? Robin,
Fine.
how are you? And around the table we go. It is noon. We have so much time and so little to learn. Of course, I mean that in the opposite. So we have a few folks who are here for the first time this month, a few folks who are returning. Our topic of learning, as a refresher from last week, this month is Jewish wisdom from Benjamin Franklin. As a very, very quick refresher, Ben Franklin lived in the 18th century at a time when the Mussar tradition in Judaism was well on its way. And Franklin, in his autobiography published in 1797, identified 13 virtues that he suggested all of us should spend time developing in our individual lives. And his approach to developing them after identifying them was to say that in every week we should focus on one virtue, and we should keep a little notebook of the times that we have mostly looking at times when we had transgressions in those virtues, and keep a log. And every week we should change those virtues, and over a period of 13 weeks times 4 rotations, that would take us through an entire year. And over the year, we would develop a deeper sense of appreciation and, more importantly, of demonstration of those virtues in the life that we lived. And about half a generation later, in 1812, a Polish-born rabbi named Rabbi Menachem Mendel Lefin of Satanov. Anybody here's family from Satanov in Poland? I would took a shot. Wrote this collection called Cheshbon HaNefesh. Cheshbon HaNefesh means accounting of the soul. We use that phrase when we talk about the work that we do around the high holy days of reflecting on the year that was and what we want to do better going forward. And he said that there are 13 virtues that we should develop in our lives, and we should keep a little book, and we should make note of what they are. And very clearly, although he doesn't name him by name, the work that Lefin put in Cheshbon HaNefesh was inspired by the work that Franklin had published in 1797. And it's also my contention that Franklin was inspired by his knowledge of the Mussar movements, because there's no way that in the same era, two folks came up with the exact same idea in the way that they did.
I don't understand, who came first?
Franklin's book came first,
But the Mussar.
but Mussar existed before Franklin wrote his book. And this is one and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of works within the Mussar tradition. This is one that came after Franklin, but there were others who came before Franklin. So I think there's a little bit of a feedback loop going on. But what makes it clear, and I mentioned this last week, what makes it clear that there was a connection between Lefin and Franklin is these were the lists of the 13 virtues that they suggested. We have Franklin's list on the left. We have Lefin's list on the right, translated from Hebrew on the far right to English on the near right. And as you can see, there are just too many similarities in the lists for this to be a coincidence. Any questions of where are we in the conversation? For those of you who were not here last week or previous weeks, I would encourage you, if you want, we do have a box of name cards and name tents. So if you don't have a name card and you would like to be called by your name around the conversation this afternoon, which we would encourage, please go ahead and make a name tent for yourself.
Does
Ruth.
come from the 13 attributes of
God?
Hashem?
So that's the interesting other question. These are not the 13 attributes that we read about in Torah, that we recite at the Chagim in those moments. So they are not the 13, but the idea of there being 13 seems a little too coincidental to be coincidental, right? We don't have much to go on as to what was going on in Franklin's mind when he published these in 1797, right? It was published, he didn't write a book on the 13 virtues. It was one little episode in the hundreds, if not thousands of episodes that he chronicled in his autobiography, where he mentioned, I had this idea, right, of having these 13 virtues. But we know that Franklin, like many of his peers of his generation, like Washington, like Hamilton, like Jefferson, like Adams, they were men who may or may not have been deeply religious in their practice, but were deeply knowledgeable of Christianity and Judaism, to a degree Islam, and certainly scripture as a genre of literature. So it wouldn't surprise me to learn that Franklin knew that there were these 13 attributes that at least Jews ascribed to the Holy One.
Say it so many times. but-
We do. No, he wasn't Jewish. So how much he knew of the practice of Jewish life, it's unclear, right? Jewish life in America today, what is the population of Jews in America, give or take? About 2%. It was significantly lesser in the late 18th century, but there were Jewish communities in Philadelphia, in New York, certainly in Charleston, right at the time. So we could presume that Franklin knew that there were these people called Jews who practiced traditions following the Hebrew Bible and others. But whether or not Ruth, he knew that we recited these 13 attributes, Hashem, El, I would have no way of knowing whether he knew that or not. It would surprise me if he did. Fran, was that a hand or a head scratch? Okay, fixing the shoulder. All right. Let's jump in forward. As you can see, if we translate what Franklin put out as his attributes, we can see the connection. There is an almost one-to-one. There's nichuta and nichuta, and shtika, and seder, and charitzut and charitzut. Different order, but essentially the same 13. Thank you, Rashina. You get a check mark in your shtika column for the week. And you brought Judith in, but in the practice of silence, Rashina gets a check mark in her book for the week. Not to beat a dead horse, but this is on the left. This was the guide that Franklin suggested that we carry around for us to chronicle our practice of his 13 virtues. And on the left, this is the guide that Lefin published in Cheshbon HaNefesh. Again, too coincidental to be coincidental. All right. Today, we are going to actually jump into some of the various midots, some of the various virtues. Lefin is in some of them much more, he's verbose at everything, as you're going to see. But we're going to learn a little bit. So join me in the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You make us holy with commandments and have commanded us to engage in words of Torah. Okay. So the first midah that we're going to study is what Franklin calls moderation or toleration, and what in Hebrew we call savlanut. Anyone know what savlanut is best translated as? Guns N' Roses could tell you, because they wrote a whole song about it. Patience, thank you, Lauren.
What is it?
Patience.
The name of the song.
Patience. All we need is just a little patience.
Generation.
Yeah. This is the one that I work on the most personally. As Abu El-Banat, father of daughters and teacher of teenagers, I seek of this. It was fun to teach this Mussar Midat to our 8th graders this year, earlier in the year. All right. Franklin, avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. That is what Franklin suggests that moderation or toleration would be. Lefin says, when something bad happens to you and you did not have the power to avoid it, do not aggravate the situation even more through wasted grief. That is the end of what Franklin said about what it means to demonstrate moderation and toleration. We'll share more about what Lefin means when he says sablanut, but just in these first two ideas, what are similarities, what are some differences, or Spencer, whatever you want to offer to the conversation by raising your hand.
I really just wondered, Levin's translation is more recent, right?
So meaning the English of it, or when he wrote his collection?
English, because the Franklin is obviously direct, but the Levin sounds a little more modern.
So Franklin is of his time, yes, and this is the translation of Lefin. Lefin wrote in Hebrew, right? If you want to know what he wrote in Hebrew, I can tell you. That can be helpful for you.
I'm not really, I couldn't understand it.
Right. So what Lefin says is the translation is of this century. I do want to underscore that while it's spelled Levin, he comes from Poland in the 18th century. There is a deep influence of German and Yiddish in his language. How many of you know the name of the second of the four imahot, the second of the four mothers in our tradition? Say it again louder, Ruth. Rivka, right? How would you spell Rivka?
I don't know, in the Hebrew.
In the Hebrew, it's a bet,
Bet.
right? Rivka is Rivka in Hebrew. That bet is a hard V. However, in German and Yiddish pronunciation, the letter V is pronounced like an F. If you go to Germany, things are not verboten, they're verboten. They're forbidden. So the V in German and Yiddish is pronounced as an F, which is why Rabbi Lefin is pronounced Lefin and not Levin, because he came from that pronunciation. Spelled the same, pronounced, it can be Rivka, it can be Rivka, it can be Rebecca. It all depends on where your bubby was from. So yes, Spencer, the translation of Lefin in English is much more modern. It's 200 years older than Franklin, which was not written in translation, was written in the English of his time. But what do we think about the similarities and differences between these two?
It doesn't say avoid extremes in Frank and Lefkin.
Right. Right. This is one of the ones where there was a little bit of a lack of alignment in the two midot between, right, what Franklin calls moderation and toleration. Lefin really is going to talk about patience, right? But he frames patience in a particular context. When do we need patience, according to Lefin?
That's a dog on 95.
So that is an example. Could you give the universal? What is the universal time that we need patience?
When someone,
When things aren't smoothly, it's written on, the answer to the question is written on the board.
something bad
When
happens,
something bad happens, right? When something you don't want to have happen happens, you may be called upon to demonstrate a variety of personal traits. One of them is patience. Now, what's brilliant about Lefin is that he must have been well plugged into 21st century psychology when he wrote this. When something bad happens to you and you did not have the power to avoid it, right? That's a unique case, right? If you did have the power to avoid it, what might your response should have been? Frustration, disappointment. In whom? Guilt. In yourself, right? You don't need to raise your hand if the answer to this is yes. But anyone who's had an experience in psychotherapy may be familiar with one of the very, very common models that therapists use to help people deal with this, which is they use the circles models. You have circles of control. That is the smallest circle, the things that you actually have control over. You have circles of influence. It's a larger circle where you have some inputs, but your input is also interacted with by the input of a lot of other people potentially as well. And then beyond your sphere of influence is the rest of the world? What capacity do you have to impact everything outside your sphere of influence? Not much of anything at all. What do most people, especially those seeking therapy, spend a lot of time worrying about? Things that are outside their sphere of control and often outside their sphere of influence. And one of the things that therapists try to do is to help people realize that that is a waste of energy. Because you absolutely can't do anything about it. Just as Lefin suggests, if it is outside your power to avoid it, don't aggravate the situation even worse through wasted grief. Don't worry that the sky may be falling. You can't do anything about it. Margaret.
The problem I have with some of these things.
We're not even 10 minutes in and you already want to leave class. I understand. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, the psychologist, you know, whatever. Listen, I was a psychology major. If they leave out human nature, it's hard, you know,
They're confronting human nature. Like, this is what they're saying, which is, we know intellectually
yes.
that there are things that are outside of our sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And no matter how hard we try, and how much we worry, and how much we emote, nothing is gonna change.
That may be, but it's hard to change one's nature. And, you know, there are people who are just negative. There are people who are constantly worrying.
You're taking us
You know
afield.
what I mean?
You're taking us afield. I'm stopping this, right? But the point is, to spend your time worrying about the things that are outside your sphere of influence, it's not healthy emotionally. And the psychologist is there to help you confront it. I saw Ruth and then Susan.
Oh, no, I was agreeing that I think he's trying to say that he doesn't want you to lead into depression.
Right.
The big.
Right, or worry, right? And again, this is about tuning ourselves. He's gonna explain how to do it. Don't worry, Margaret. Susan,
I'm not.
Um,
outside your sphere of influence.
I've had a lot of ups and downs in my life,
Mhm.
but what I have come to the conclusion, and I tell people is, don't worry until you need to worry.
Right? Right?
But there is an essence of timing here.
Of course.
A person who is young, yet has to experience all these negatives and experience their reaction to the
Mhm.
negatives. And eventually realize when they get to a certain age that the best way to deal with it is, but that takes maturity.
It does, but I would suggest that there are people who are younger who are feeling addled by their worry and haven't come to that realization on their own, that a therapist might say, one of my jobs is to help people learn this faster. Right. All right. Let's get into how Lefin says we should think about this. He begins with Torah. God, and I apologize, this is the direct translation from the Feldheim collection. It is a deeply observant organization, which is perfectly fine. I did not change the translation in linguists in any meaningful way. God's perfection is glorified in the world in three ways: through his ability, through his wisdom, and through his grace, which is granted without ulterior motive. He's talking about how we develop patience, and he says he begins with God's perfection exists in the world. The measure of God's glory is as great as the entire world, for there is not even a single grain of sand in the world which does not have within it a structure composed of the various elements of the wondrous divine wisdom. Where can wisdom from God be found in our universe?
Everywhere.
Everywhere we look. Moreover, every single grain itself does not retain its original structure, for its components are always in flux. Ipso ipso, their present structure changes and they begin to reform into a different structure. Thus, the grain composed of these components loses its natural essence and assumes a different nature. I'm wondering where he's going with this. Its place is taken by another grain, which assumes the original nature. Ipso ipso, it assumes the essence that the first grain had before it changed. The entire process is cyclical, like the turning of a wheel, with one part constantly pursuing the other. Even though all the parts of the creation are in a state of change from one moment to the next, as it says in Ecclesiastes 1:8, All things grow weary nevertheless, the world as a whole stays the same, since other elements assume the essence that the first element discarded. For as long as God so desires, as the verse states, and the earth stands forever. This is all evident in the story of nature. But in the worlds of the inanimate and of plants, we lack the ability to observe this clearly. So what is he saying? That there is constant change in the natural world, and there is constant stability in the natural world. And I'm not even sure there certainly was microscopes at this time, but at the microscopic level, or the cosmological infinitesimal level, things are always changing. But at the perceptible level, they often stay the same. Hint, hint, we can change at the imperceptible level, and we can have that change manifest in the perceptible. I can be who I am, and I can change who I am with the right intentionality. We see only the perfection of his ability and his wisdom with clarity, especially through the intelligence of the animal and the intellectual spirits which reveal the wonders of his wisdom and his grace, which is granted without ulterior motive and which are as clear as the heavens themselves. This is quite lofty. It's cosmological, it's theological. This notion that within everything in the universe, divine perfection and divine wisdom is manifest. Things are both static and dynamic at the same time. How can things be static and dynamic at the same time? Well, because God designed it that way. This is just an invitation to think in this way, that there can be constant change and constant stability. And that is how God should want it to be. Before we get into what this means for patience among us. So just kind of tuck that away in the back of your mind. Are there any questions about this? Okay. Anybody online? Clear as a bell?
A Liberty Bell?
Clear as a cracked Liberty Bell, exactly. All right. Now we're going to move more into the human experience. Even most types of pain and suffering, we are uncreated so as to give man the impetus to hasten and see a remedy for himself, to serve as protection for the body in general and for a specific limb. And when the pain intensifies and is prolonged, when it becomes more unbearable than death itself, God has prepared a strategy to attenuate it, either through inerrant through medications, which desensitize the nerves. For example, one who is used to snuffing out a candle with his fingers finds the tips of his fingers become calloused and their normal acute sensitivity disappears. This is actually a really insightful look into human nature, the truth of which I think is we sort of know it all, but we don't think about it on a day-to-day basis, perhaps because of our technological advances. According to this, what is the purpose of pain? Said another way, why did God create us in a manner that we could experience and feel pain? Fran.
So that we could invent something to help them.
So one is the second part is that we could show the manifest of God's divine wisdom in giving us our minds, that we could invent remedies. But Bob, you said to protect ourselves, right? We feel pain to show us that there is danger, right? We have that instinct to pull our hand away from the heat source, right? Because if we don't, we can injure ourselves even more, perhaps fatally. Even the pain of a broken arm, right? If we try to use our arm, like that's really, really painful, but how much more can we damage ourselves if we're trying to act with a broken limb, for example? Don't tell Cantor Lori, who's recovering nicely from her broken shoulder.
How is she doing?
She's doing well. She now has permission to not wear her sling when she is sitting in a chair at home.
Oh,
A few more weeks.
That's a step forward.
It's a step forward, exactly, right? She is developing some self-learning, some patience through this experience of weathering the recovery from this injury. Yeah, Ruth, please. This is meant to be a dialogue.
But also some people would view it also as a reason to pray to God when you're suffering.
Of course. Of course. But what I love how he lays this out is, you know, it's a fair question. If we pray to God to alleviate pain, what's the wisdom in God giving us pain in the first place? Right? If we presume that God is perfect and full of wisdom, there must be a good reason that God made us in a way that we could experience pain. And the answer is because it protects us. And when we have pain, we want it to go away because we want to move into a place where we are even better protected. And so we pay for the pain to go away. And this is why I love our late medieval and even early medieval thinkers. They were not afraid of medicine as something that goes against God's will. They see medical intervention as manifest of the wisdom that God gave us to develop it. This goes all the way back to Maimonides 1,000 years ago, and we even see it here. God has prepared a strategy to attenuate it through medications, which desensitize the nerves. Now, did we find these medications hidden behind the stump of a tree that God made for us? No. How did we find the medications?
People got it.
We developed them, right? No, we tried different species that God put on earth, but using the wisdom, and I'm going to underscore this, using the wisdom that God gave us, we figured out how they could be medicinal. It's God-human partnership made manifest. And our bodies have some ways of repairing ourselves and making themselves stronger, right? So when we develop calluses, for example, on our limbs, it's to prevent us from the injury that can come from a repeated behavior for whom is essential for us. If you are a woodworker, your hands are going to get calloused because you need to be able to protect yourself from that in ways that if you are a scrivener, your hands will not be calloused in the same way. Some people will in certain places, right? I don't have too many calluses on my finger except the one under my wedding ring that I wear. And that one hurts a lot when I'm trying to lift weights. So I wear.
It's a sign.
Right,
Right.
right. But the idea, and of course, no, I don't think there are many folks in our time today who would snuff out a candle with their finger. But in that era, it was pretty common. Oh, right. Or the head, but for whatever reason, if you're a person who regularly snuffs out a candle, your skin is gonna burn, and then it's gonna heal, and it's gonna burn, and it's gonna heal, and eventually you'll get to a point where it's so calloused that you don't even feel the pain anymore.
So this description stays in that like smaller sphere, right? It stays in when you were talking about
The sphere of control.
Well, and it stays within us, right?
Mhm.
But it's interesting because like the practice of this, right? Like to be thinking about your experience of pain or suffering or whatever.
Go back to when you said this stays within us. What do you mean by that?
Like the description here is kind of like our own personal experience within our bodies.
As opposed to what isn't it in your mind?
I'm thinking that pain and suffering also exist within each of us as a point of connection. So that's all. Like, but this description is really like insulating.
And what or who should we think about is in each of our pains that might form some of that connective tissue?
Right.
God.
Of course, yes.
Right, there's like this idea that God is even in the pain. Right, that because God created us to have pain for these reasons. Spencer.
As it relates to not physical, but emotional pain.
Sure.
We're talking about patience, does this have a relation to that? And just
Absolutely.
accidentally about the kind of
He's using this very physical analogy, but I think that there's all kinds of grounds to think that what's physical can be emotional, psychological, and vice versa. And I'm not talking about like psychosomatic symptoms or the idea that mental pain can manifest physically, although I believe it can, but the metaphors that we use, right? A physical injury requires time and patience and perhaps therapy, physical therapy to heal. Why wouldn't a mental injury have the same needs? right? Maybe, or not maybe, probably mental anguish is also a way to protect us. And we have to figure out what that is too. Okay, greater than this, pain and suffering, are the worry, here we go, the worry and fear which precede pain. They spur man to apply his intellect to avoid even the beginning of pain by moving away from its path so it cannot strike him at all, or at least to choke it at its source before it comes real. Nevertheless, since man is so often careless or pays no heed to these advanced warnings because we're stupid, either because he is lazy or because of the desires of his animal spirit, his base, his ego, his yetzer, he sometimes finds himself suffering from pain which comes upon him suddenly. Why he decided that he thought he could jump from the roof of his house into his pool is beyond me, but he thought it would be fun. People do this. It's all over TikTok. And has been for years. Giovanna.
You're still on Franklin.
What's that?
You're still on Franklin.
No, this is Lefin. This is all Lefin. This is not Franklin.
That's what-
This is all Lefin. Yet, despite this, a thread of his grace is drawn over him and introduces regret, which is added to the anguish which he already feels. Man reflects and is greatly sorry for not having been careful while there was still time, and for not having heeded either of those who offered reproof or his teachers. His anguish perpetuates deeper and deeper into his inner recesses, and therefore engraves in his memory a resolution to not repeat his mistake and stumble once again. Lefin's a very good rabbi. He takes a very simple idea and draws it out linguistically, and it makes it so overwrought to fill the hour of service so folks feel like they can go home having learned something. The pain associated with this regret persists longer than does the physical suffering itself, for it can be reawakened long after the pain itself has left him. Ipso, every time he recalls what happened. At times it appears after some other sin, associating itself with the worry of impending punishment, stinging the depths of his soul. This is the motivating force that brings man to repent, a force created to cleanse the stains of past sins and erase the memory of their being from our hearts. Margaret.
So Franklin doesn't go into any of this stuff. He just has his.
One sentence.
One sentence, and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
So Lefin is.
As a good Protestant, Franklin is short to the point, and as a good Ashkenazi rabbi, Lefin has to pull out every string and pull it apart and thread it apart. But this notion, right, this interplay between pain, and I think, what I love about how we cross out is it could be physical pain, it could be emotional pain, right? I keep making the same mistakes, and I keep feeling the same anguish, and then I get mad at myself for having made the mistake and giving myself the anguish, and then I feel more anguish for what I've done, and I pray that God can help me to learn my lesson, so I don't repeat the mistake in the future. But how many of us can say over our lives, we repeated the same mistakes over and over and over? I wasn't asking for an answer there, my hand would go up first, right? Until finally, if you're lucky, you learn to break that pattern. And I would suggest that a lot of therapists spend a lot of time with their patients, helping them break those patterns.
That's what you
Yeah, of course it's there, right? That's the animal spirits, right? And this is where I think for someone like Franklin, he makes it seem so easy. Just act with moderation. And Lefin is saying that's so easy to write tersely in 3 sentences, but we know what the human condition is actually like.
That's
Spencer.
like for Franklin, it's so easy to write chastity, but then doing it and reporting it.
Well, yeah, exactly, right? Now, at the same time, Franklin wasn't saying you're not gonna break this. He's gonna say, right, he didn't tell you to keep a book of all the times you acted with chastity or all the times you acted with moderation. What was the plan that he suggested? Keep a log of when you didn't act that way, because that's human nature. Right? If we can minimize our transgressions, that's a success, let alone maximize our successes.
Yeah, he didn't minimize that transgression.
No, no.
Few lines, but of course, they have all that information when it
Right,
was let it out.
right. So if we pull back to what Lefin said at the beginning, when something bad happens to you and you do not have the power to avoid it, do not aggravate the situation even more through wasted grief. How is that patience? Whom is he inviting us to take patience, to have patience for?
Ourselves.
Ourselves, right? Fran?
Could also be have patience for the process.
Of course, yeah, and I do think in this is also patience in other people, right? So I am Spencer, or I am, this happened to me yesterday. I got caught in traffic. I had to take my sister-in-law back to the airport after she graciously spent the weekend with us helping with some childcare needs. And I had a lunch at 12:30. And there was traffic on 595, and there was traffic getting back up here. And I finally get off and I'm at Glades, trying to get east or west across town. And wouldn't you know, I got caught behind every single person who needed to make a right turn who was in the left lane. For some reason, there is an extra special amount of that here in Boca Raton, especially in this particular time of the year. And someone was trying to cut across 4 lanes, and I would have had to have come to a complete stop to let them in, which I thought actually was unsafe. So I didn't let them in. And they honked at me. And I could have, and then I look out my rear view mirror and I see them blocking like 4 other cars. And I said to myself, shame on them. Right? If I thought for a moment that I was wrong by not letting them in, I realized I would still have been stopped behind them while they were waiting for the next lane to open up. And I forgave myself. And I forgive that person. But this idea of patience is that, like, getting frustrated, getting angry with the people around you when you have no way to impact what they are going to do. It is outside my sphere of influence. It is certainly outside my sphere of control. That anger is wasted grief. If I can just learn to let it roll off of my shoulders. Margaret, is that easy to do? No, it's not easy to do. It takes practice. It takes intentionality. That's the larger picture of Mussar, is these are things that we aspire to. Are we ever going to perfect it? No. No, but if every morning I'm doing what Lefin suggested, which is I begin in the morning, reminding myself today I'm going to focus on patience, and I'm seeking opportunity to act with patience, I'll probably behave differently in that moment than if I wasn't focusing on patience for this particular week.
I think as you get older too, you're able to handle these different situations better than when.
I disagree. I think some people is true, and now I'm gonna put my job in jeopardy.
Never mind, never mind.
As a younger person living in a community that has an outsized segment of a retired population, some of the retired folks in this community have gotten to that golden age of patience. And some in that community have less patience than a toddler.
You're right.
Yeah.
I've seen it in their behaviors. I'm sure you all have too. Of course, nobody in this room,
Yeah.
or on Zoom for that matter.
Forgiveness kind of become more important than patience. If you can forgive whatever, another person, the way things are, or kind of like forgive, wouldn't that lead into patience?
So forgiveness can live into patience. And listen, there are other attributes and they are interrelated. But I think what Lefin is saying is that if we amplify our sense of patience, we will minimize the need to give forgiveness because we would not have gotten aggravated and had the wasted grief in the first place for which we want to forgive others and ultimately ourselves. So it's a yes and.
I was just thinking when Moses hit the rock, you know, like you would think that wasn't a big deal. And, right, we learned from that,
Right.
that was a huge.
It was right, and why did that happen? Why did he strike the rock?
Aggravated.
He was aggravated, right? That rabble was getting under his skin. Talk about wasted grief. Right? If that had been his patience week, he probably would have been, he probably would have acted differently for the rock and maybe made it to the promised land.
I think it was unfair punishment.
It may have
That
been.
wasn't fair.
It may have been. Well, that's between you and God.
How do you turn your grief around? I mean, your mind, you know, is running around and with problems. And you know, I mean, you say, mind, can you stop it? I'd like to have some patience, and yet it keeps going. How do we solve that?
So that I think is a different question than what we're talking about right now, right? Because this is a strategy to not to waste grief, right? That impatience leads to waste grief. You're talking about a different emotional. There are experiences that we have that grieve us, right? Patience may not be the proper or the necessary or the appropriate traits to demonstrate in that moment, other than to say, don't get mad at yourself for being caught in a cycle of grief. Don't add to the grief by saying, how come I'm feeling grief? Grief is a natural thing. We experience tragedy. Give yourself the time and space for the grief to work itself out. Our bodies are incredibly resilient. I was listening to a podcast this morning. Adam Grant was interviewing, I'm forgetting the name of the scholar talked about. He told this interesting anecdote that most people significantly overestimate the emotional impact of tragedy on their life. In particular, the length of time that they are going to experience it. So for example, they did a study where they asked that they got a baseline happiness of people, and the average baseline happiness, I'm gonna paraphrase this, was 7. And then they told people they lost their jobs, or people had just lost their jobs. And in the immediate aftermath of their job loss, their average happiness was a 3. And they asked them, what do you anticipate your happiness to be 5 years from now? And they said, oh, I'm still gonna be at a 3, I'm never gonna recover from this. And 5 years later, what was their average happiness? 6. Yeah, essentially the same, right? That in the moment of grief, we vastly underestimate our body's ability and our psyche's ability to heal, right? And from the greatest, from God forbid, the loss of loved ones, close loved ones, children's family, and those really terrible things. When you talk to most people, a good amount of years after that happened, right? 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they say they are living happy lives. Not everybody, but most people. We recover even from those great tragedies. But what we don't want to do is in the moment, get on our own case for not healing fast enough. That's the patience that we want. Now, for people who feel like they are not progressing like they need to, that's what my advice is, talk to a therapist. Linda, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you for your supplement.
You are welcome. So Lefin tells us what we shouldn't be doing, but does he offer ways to get to that point?
Check the book.
Not really.
That's so interesting. I would think, because this is a religious man, correct?
Yeah.
You would think, or I would think, that he would choose things out of the Torah that are teachable moments or something to help you get to the point that he's trying to get you to get to.
I'm going to read something else. All that we have said relates only to those vicissitudes which we could have escaped in advance, or which we could find a remedy or deal with once they have occurred. As concerns those serious incidents which have come upon us unavoidably, and which we were powerless to prepare for, or which we could not deal with once they transpired, God has given us a remedial regimen. Patience. Through this trait, one can dull the soul's pain as much as physical pain can be dulled by drugs which harden the nerves and stem from the brain stems. As the verse in Mishle says, it's Mishle is Proverbs, man's spirit sustains him in sickness. Hence, we must fulfill God's will. We must exert ourselves, enjoy the wisdom and understanding which he has granted us, and guard our steps and use them as best we can. If despite our efforts, we are still faced with evil through his providence, we are obligated to recognize the last favor of his, the trait of patience, which he has given us. We are to utilize it as a means of lessening our pain and accept our wounds by those inflicted by our faithful lover, the exalted benefactor. For beyond doubt, they, our pain, too, were only created for our benefits. He doesn't actually get into the how. He just says patience is the remedy. Patience is what we should lean into when we're not really sure how to get through the pain. Because I think in there is the presumption that we will heal on our own. The wounds we heal, time heals all wounds. Why? Because God. And if they don't, there's God's reasons for that too. And that's sort of the religiosity in there. And I can appreciate that for some of us in this room, that theology may not be our Jewish theology of the 21st century, but it was the Jewish theology of the early 19th century and much of our tradition. Spencer.
Everyone kind of comes to that patience in their own way, though. With him, he said he didn't want to go a set way because everyone could come to it differently.
Yeah.
He was a rabbi, he probably saw a lot of examples.
Maybe.
You know, this just reminds me, I don't know if you think it's relative, but
Speak up.
it reminds me, whether it's relevant or not. I must have been 12, 13, 14
Margaret, you gotta put
years.
your hand down. You gotta really enunciate so the room can hear you.
13, 14, I don't know how old that was, and I lost my wallet. My father was here, he says, why aren't you angry? Why
Let her
aren't
finish and
you,
I'll reiterate it.
why aren't you angry about this? And he was irritated that I did, it's like I didn't care. I said, what can I do about it?
Right, so Margaret's telling the story when she was a preteen, she lost her wallet, which happens to us. And most people might act out of anger for this having happened, as your father would have suggested. But I think in that moment, Margaret, that was a really good example of what Lefin is suggesting. The wallet is gone. Getting angry about it isn't gonna do anything. That was an example of this Mussar approach to patience. Well done, gold star for you.
Who knew?
Who knew? All right, let's move into a new midah. We got about 12 minutes left. We'll see where this can take us. This one's a bit more direct. Nikiyut, cleanliness. Franklin says, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Ouch. Say more, Rashina. Rashina says, ouch.
He missed that.
I mean, if you just think of the faults or the flaws, like, to the maintenance of that,
Mm-hmm.
I think is aspirational.
So it's interesting, right? Rashina reads this as how hard it must be to have no uncleanliness in body or clothes or habitation, right where we live. And of course, my wondering is, well, we know what cleanliness was like in the 1780s and 90s, right? They didn't have what we have today to keep things clean. So I have to wonder, are you projecting onto Franklin a level of cleanliness, right? To what us means no uncleanliness seems, I think, a very, very, very high barrier to, and I wonder whether what Franklin would have said if he was the inspector, what was a level of cleanliness to meet this burden may actually be very, very low as compared to what we know of uncleanliness in our time. Right, I'm thinking, so when I went to summer camp, right, and nowadays at the Jewish summer camps, there is a period that they called Nikayon. You can hear the connection between Nikiyut and Nikayon. Nikayon is cleaning time. It's when each cabin has to clean their cabin, right? And the campers have to make their beds and hang up their clothes and sweep the floor and clean the bathrooms and all these things. And we had the same thing when I was a camper. And every single day, there was a counselor who went around to each of the cabins and would inspect each cabin, inspection, right? And there was and if you got perfect inspection, you got celebrated. And if you got 7 days in a row of perfect inspection, your cabin got to go to town for ice cream over rest hour one day. If you got 14 days in a row of perfect inspection, you got to go to pizza for dinner. But if there was one piece of trash, one wrapper in your green bucket, that was the garbage can on the cabin. If there was one piece of trash one day, that's a 9, not perfect. You're back to starting again and you're in, right? So my wondering for you, Rashina, is would our inspector agree to what no uncleanliness is to what Franklin's inspector might say?
Yeah.
Because I have to imagine it would have been less.
It just feels sterile, that's all. Oh, feels like it.
But he didn't know from sterility.
Well, they had different reasons.
Yeah, Ruth, go ahead. You don't need to apologize.
Sounds more like a spiritual impurity.
Not in this. He's talking about your body. He's very
Yeah,
clear.
but no, it's like when you couldn't go into the temple, into the Beit HaMikdash, if you had certain impurities.
Yeah.
And they were physical,
I'm gonna say no.
no?
No. Cleanliness and ritual purity are different concepts. They are very much different concepts. In Judaism, but certainly for Franklin. Right? Franklin is not talking Jewish, he's talking
no,
physical.
Lefin, I meant.
But we're not on Lefin yet, we're on Franklin,
Oh, I'm sorry.
right?
Franklin probably had a maid and a valet.
He had all those things, right? And he would be washed, but
But didn't have a vacuum.
But, or air conditioning, or any of those things, or washing machine, or all those kinds of things. But to your point, Ruth, in our tradition, it's important to distinguish nikiyut, cleanliness, from tahara, which is ritual purity. There are physical acts that may go into both, like immersion in water and those kinds of things, but they had very different purposes. Lefin says, let no stain or ugliness be found in your possessions or in your home, and surely not on your body or your clothes.
What did she say?
Margaret invited us all over for lunch after the cleaning person comes. Right? So similarities here, right? Clothes, body, home, mentioned from each, no stain, no ugliness, tolerate no uncleanliness. So I think there's a similarity, right? One of the ones where clearly Lefin had read Franklin, and he just framed it a little bit differently. But what does this mean? From the time of his birth, when the sensory organs, the eyes and the ears, become receptive to the components of the world at large, man progresses. God, it's just huge. Everything is just huge. From day to day, he sees new things. Different species of animals. He's like Richard Attenborough. Different species of animals, trees and herbs, which are different in their nature, their color, their aromas, and their sizes. You can just imagine penguins walking around. He assimilates traces of these impressions into his memory one by one, collecting them to build a framework of a private world within the psyche of his animal spirit. He continually adds new forms of previously hidden details, of forms which he had already seen, until this small world is almost as sophisticated as the great world.
You use the word psyche?
He used the word psyche. Afterwards, the intellectual spirit crystallizes within this collection, reigning over it and illuminating it so that it controls the small world, much as the Shekhinah exercises its providence over the world at large. It is then that man begins to cleanse his body of the tar and dirt in which he was immersed, so as to render his body fit to serve as a receptacle for his supernal soul, which is most fastidious and loathes all forms of sordidness. We are a vessel of something supernal, supernatural, holy, of the above. And so if we are to receive it, in what state should the receptacle be?
Clean.
Clean. The entire Torah, written and that which is orally transmitted, is replete with exhortations and Ruth, to your point, cleanliness and spiritual purity. Different ideas. The ablutions of the feet and the hands by the Kohen, the washing of the hands and the ritual immersions, cleaning and washing in warm water, and so on, are becoming to the Jewish nation and to all who believe in the Creator, and among whom the Shekhinah dwells. As we read in Devarim and Deuteronomy, and your encampment shall be holy, and he shall not see you a foul thing. How much more must Torah scholars sanctify themselves so that their bodies not be debased in the eyes of other men? As our sages say, and this is in the Talmud and Shabbat 114a, any Torah scholar who has a stain found on his clothing incurs the penalty of death. Jesus had nothing to do with it.
The sound.
And they also said in Baba Batra, the bed of an ignoramus is like a storehouse, and cleanliness leads to purity. You can see this for yourself. If you are accosted by a loathsome looking man, his shoes and socks covered in mud, a wreath of mire surrounding the edges of his clothing, his shirt and pants torn and tattered and filthy, with his dirty flesh peeping out from the hole. It's so descriptive. His hair covered with feathers, and his skin marked with disgusting stains. You immediately recoil in revulsion, without pausing to think that your impression might be erroneous. Perhaps this man is a wealthy person who has lost his land and his wealth. Perhaps he is from an outstanding family, a Torah scholar possibly. If this is the way that you were affected by the shortcoming of others, then you had better remember to take care of yourself. Don't say, I am preoccupied, with heavenly matters. How can I waste my time with bodily matters just for the sake of appearances? Our sages said in Menachem 37b, human dignity is great, for it overrides the negative precepts of the Torah. We wash our hands traditionally before we eat a meal. We wash it by pouring water over our hands. That is separate from the washing that we might do to clean our hands with soap or Purell, right? Obviously, there is some antiseptic value in the pouring of the water over our hands. But in an age when we understand human cleanliness at the level of soap, washing your hands with soap and water does not satisfy the mitzvah of washing your hands before you eat a meal. Two different kinds of purification. One physical, that's the cleanliness, and the other is spiritual. It's important. Spencer.
So after you wash your hands in soap, you should then wash your hands in plain water?
Yeah, so, if you're going to Shabbat dinner, for example, right? It's good practice to wash your hands before you get to the table. And there, you'll stand, you may sing Shalom Aleichem, you may make Kiddush, and then when it's time for the motzi in a traditional environment, everyone will go and wash their hands, usually using a washing cup. And then they say motzi and begin the meal. But if you've washed your hands with soap and water before the meal, it does not satisfy the mitzvah requirements of the washing of hands in that way. This Saturday night, we're gonna wash our hands 3 times. Once with soap and water before the Seder starts, once at the beginning of the Seder, and then once again in the middle of the Seder. different goals, but getting us back to cleanliness, right? He paints this beautiful picture of this putrid looking human being who we might think is really someone to be afraid of. And all he's doing is teasing us with our presumptions. When we see someone present that way, it causes us to recoil. That's the human nature piece. And he's saying, be aware of your natures. I think he's saying, don't make presumptions about who that person is based on how they present themselves. You never know. Right? Who's ever seen The Beauty and the Beast or read The Beauty and the Beast? That's the story, right? This.
Boston one was good.
No, we'll talk later. But the idea of this haggard looking woman presents herself at the door of the prince. He casts her away because of her appearance. She's actually a beautiful enchantress and she curses him. That's half number one. Half number two is, and for your own appearance, don't let someone treat you badly by appearing in a way that might tempt them to making a negative thought about you. Present yourself as respectable as possible. This is what I teach our teenagers when they read about the ritual garb that the priests wear in the Torah portions, right? That what you wear matters. There are times and places. It is inappropriate to wear sweatpants on the bima for your bat mitzvah. It's inappropriate to wear a suit and tie to play basketball. And everything in between. And being cognizant of what you're wearing when is a way to show respect with the people you're interacting. We can talk about how the levels of what you should wear may have degraded over the generations. But there's still a sense of what I wear into a space reflects what I think about that space. We're past time. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
I will not